Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the interesting things about Tolkien's view of evil is its ultimately self-defeating nature. Part of this also, of course, comes from his Catholic, worldview that, in the Christian idea, the evil is necessarily going to be self-defeating in a sense. But it also kind of springs just from his particular view of evil, which is kind of very Boethian. And if you don't know what I mean by Boethian, it's this kind of idea that evil in itself doesn't really exist. It's kind of the negation of good. It's the absence of good. And so ultimately it never amounts to anything. And so it kind of has to be self-defeating. So there's a lot of that going into it. But what I want to do in this video is explore the ways in which Tolkien's really major bad guys actually exemplify this idea by having their own plans backfire, often in spectacular fashion. And since we know that middle management is always incompetent, we're going to start with the low-level villains and work our way up. So by middle management, I am of course talking about Saruman. You could say Sauron might be middle management, but I consider him upper management. He's just not quite CEO. So let's take a look at Saruman and see what we can find out from him. Of course, we have two ways in which we can kind of look at Saruman's failures as a bad guy. One of them is kind of expressly highlighted by Gandalf at one point because he mentions that in capturing Merry and Pippin and bringing them with ridiculous speed via the capture of the Uruk-hai to Fangorn, he has only accelerated or even caused the Ents to end up attacking Isengard and basically completely wrecking everything, all of his plans and everything. And of course, his combined with this is also the fact that he had literally just sent his entire army to destroy Rohan and so had virtually no defense when the Ents attack. And so in his attempt to gain the ring, he ends up bringing about, or at least hastening, his own complete defeat, because had he not sent those Uruk-hai to try to find the ring bearer and brought Merry and Pippin to where he did, they wouldn't have come in contact with the Ents. And Gandalf basically points this out and says, all he's done is serve to, bring Merry and Pippin here just in the nick of time. And so it's weird how that specifically kind of ends up doing that. But in a more general sense, Saruman's entire broader strategy is also self-defeating, because one of the things that Gandalf also points out is the fact that Saruman realized at some point that being, with Sauron or against Sauron, but pretending to be with Sauron is a really dangerous place to be. And he's like, if I don't, basically explains the reasoning is, if Saruman doesn't get the ring for himself, now that he's more or less made it clear that he's actually not really trying to help Sauron, but really in it for himself, he's going to be in between a rock and a hard place, because he's got, the good guys on one side and Sauron on the other. And if he doesn't get the ring, he's doomed no matter who wins. And so, even in this broader sense, Gandalf points out that by trying to walk this fine line of being, in theory, on Sauron's side, pretending to be on Sauron's side, but really just serving his own interests and trying to get the ring for himself, he has put himself in the worst possible position, because if he fails, and the odds are he will, it's gonna be bad no matter who turns out on top in the overall struggle. So you've got this example of just the overall strategy being a really poor one, but also the Merry and Pippin thing being just a really specific event brought about by his own actions that leads to his own downfall. So that's two very different but related ways in which Saruman shoots himself in the foot. Now we move up to upper management, and that of course is Sauron. And here again we have two basic ideas that we can look at. And there are probably other ways that you can look at all three of these characters and how they And by three, I'm talking, of course, of Morgoth being the third. Uh, you could probably find numerous examples, but I'm focusing on like the bigger, more obvious ones. Sauron, I'm going to start further back in his history, and we're going to look at the Second Age. After Sauron creates the One Ring and tries to conquer Middle Earth, the people of Numenor, realize that there's this power in Middle Earth that's, gaining more power and becoming more and more aggressive. And the king, who at that point is already fairly corrupt and not really a good guy in the real sense of the term, wants to conquer Sauron, not so much to help Middle Earth, but because he's like, nobody's going to be bigger than me. And so he sends his army to basically either attack or capture Sauron. This is not really the backfiring part. It kind of is a backfire in the sense that Sauron, when the Numenorians arrive on Middle Earth shores, he realizes that, oh, they're a little tougher than I thought. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but this isn't really the big one. What happens is Sauron pretends to surrender and is taken as a hostage, more or less willingly, to Numenor, where he then begins to really, really corrupt the king of Numenor and eventually get him to, attack Valinor in an attempt to gain immortality for himself. Because Sauron has been feeding him lies, saying that the Valar are just withholding immortality from men, and that if they just take Valinor, which is where, the immortal people live, then he will become immortal. This is really dumb from any number of point of views, but at any rate, the king of Numenor falls for it, and as he's getting really old and feeling like, I'm going to die soon, I should probably get on with this idea, he ends up attacking Numenor. Sauron is left in, he attacks Valinor. Sauron is left in Numenor, and he thinks everything's peachy and that the Numenorian army is just going to be completely wiped out and he'll be fine and he'll just go back and start doing more of what he does in Middle Earth. Little does he expect the fact that the Valar, in view of all these events, eventually basically call on Eru Ilúvatar and basically say, we're going to step back from our role of, being the caretakers of Middle Earth, and Ilúvatar, you do what you want to do with this situation. So Ilúvatar basically chucks some mountains on the armies of Numenor, but he also sinks the island, and in the sinking of the island of Numenor, Sauron gets destroyed, or at least his bodily form gets destroyed. And as a result of that, he is weakened for a time, and it takes him a while to, be able to take shape again and really start doing anything. And this gives the escapees from Numenor, Elendil and his sons, time to build up kingdoms in Gondor and Arnor and become powerful enough to really stomp on Sauron all over again in the battle of the Second Alliance, of the Last Alliance. And so Sauron, by getting Numenor destroyed, also set himself up to not really be ready for when the few Numenorians who did escape came and decided to, beat him down in Middle Earth again, because he had to waste so much time recovering his own strength. So that's one example. The second example should be kind of obvious if you think about it, and it's the creation of the ring itself. Because when he creates the ring, he puts so much of his own power into it, because he has to make it work the way he needs it to control the other rings of power. It basically makes him completely vulnerable. If he had not done that, he probably would not have been able to be ultimately defeated. He could be defeated in the sense that he could be killed over and over again, but he could always come back, as he did after the War of the Last Alliance, because being a Maya, he is not capable of being ultimately destroyed. But because he put so much of his power into the ring, when the ring gets destroyed, so much of his own power is destroyed with it that he ends up being reduced to a state where he's not really capable of ever being a threat again. He's not annihilated in the sense that he's gone, but he's in a weak state to the point that he can never really recover in the way that he had before. And even his prior recoveries, it's like they're things that he loses along the way. After he's destroyed in the fall of Numenor, he doesn't get to come back and look like a nice guy. He's going to look, dark and misshapen and just not like a pleasant fellow ever after. But he comes back, and he comes back with a significant amount of power. After the destruction of the ring, that's over. So, in this way, Sauron's plan to dominate everybody else through the creation of the ring ends up leading to his own defeat. And it's one of those things where it seems like it should work just fine, because if he still has the ring and everything, he's powerful enough to basically just wipe everybody out. But as it turns out, the Second Alliance, Elendil and Gil-galad and others, they're strong enough to take him on still, and so having the ring does not prevent him from losing. Later on, if he had had the ring at the end of the Third Age, pretty much would have been unstoppable. But in the Second Age, there were still those with power enough to actually defeat him, and that led to the fact that he loses the One Ring, which sets up his own ultimate destruction. Now we move to the top of the food chain, and that is Melkor or Morgoth. And with Melkor or Morgoth, there's several different things that kind of come back to bite him a little bit, and it's not nearly as concrete with him as it is with Sauron and Saruman, but there are some pretty clear examples. So for one thing, and some of this you kind of have to pick up either by reading between the lines or reading some of the other material outside of the Silmarillion itself, but there's this idea that in Morgoth trying to control more and more of Middle-earth itself, he is spending more and more of his power in just controlling the people, mainly the orcs and some of the men. And as a result of that, he is dissipating himself and becoming innately weaker. And so there's this, in the volume of the History of Middle-earth called Morgoth's Ring, which I think is volume 10, Tolkien really gets into this idea and basically says that all of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. And so it's the idea that, like Sauron put his power into the ring, Morgoth puts all of his power into Middle-earth itself, which causes the corruption that you see in Middle-earth, but it also decreases his power and makes him more vulnerable to be captured, defeated, whatever it is. But even in the Silmarillion itself, you get some of this idea, and you can see how it ends up coming back to bite him, because in the process of doing all this to control Middle-earth and make things that let him just defeat his enemies, he ends up becoming basically a total coward, loses a lot of his innate strength, such that one of the Valar is enough to basically take him on, when before he was the greatest of all of them and could have possibly taken more than one on at a time. But ultimately, it's this spending of his own power in an attempt to control something that was never meant to be controlled by him. It was meant to be, he was meant to be more or less a steward of it, if anything, but not to try to rule it as a tyrant. So in trying to rule it as a tyrant, he ends up actually becoming less of a being in and of himself. And so there's, not only does that mean that he's capable of being defeated more easily, in a sense, because once his orcs and balrogs and dragons, which are easy enough for the Valar to take on by themselves, once all these things are gone, what's he left with? He doesn't get all that power back. He's still weaker, and so he's really easy to defeat. And so he's spending a lot of power to become a tyrant, but it ends up making him into a much lesser being and easier to be captured, which leads to his capture, when the elves first appear in Middle-earth and the Valar throw him in jail basically for several ages worth of time while he thinks things over, and they're hoping that he repents, which he doesn't, of course. At any rate, that's kind of the more general one. But the other one that's kind of interesting is the more specific events that lead up to the main stories of the Silmarillion, which is his theft of the Silmarils. And in stealing the Silmarils and then absconding to Middle-earth, and bound up in all of this too, is the idea that he had been trying to pit the Noldor against each other. So Feanor he tries to set against Fingolfin, his half-brother, and all this other stuff. interestingly enough, Fingolfin ends up kind of resolving with Feanor, although Feanor, you don't get the idea, ever really fully was on board with the idea, but Fingolfin certainly seems in good faith in resolving with Feanor any disputes that they had due to the lies that Morgoth was spreading. But he was trying to do all this at the same time and then ended up stealing the Silmarils, and so the Noldor kind of already don't like him by the time he steals the Silmarils because they realize that he's behind a lot of the shady dealings. And when he leaves, then Feanor is so mad, and by the way, he also kills Feanor's dad in the process of stealing the Silmarils. So Feanor, because of this, decides he's going to go back to Middle-earth to chase Morgoth and hunt him down, kill him, take the Silmarils. Foolish. He's not powerful enough to do that, but it does lead to the Noldor as a group going back to Middle-earth. And here again, if you read some of the texts outside of the Silmarillion proper, and I don't remember which volume this is in, but Tolkien basically mentions, the Noldor are basically kind of like the perfect anti-Morgoth scheme, because they're, immortal, they're really powerful. The Noldor who are in Valinor are just, super elves, basically, and they're tireless in their attempt to, make sure that Morgoth can't do anything. They can't actually attack him and take the Silmarils back, but they are capable of basically keeping him in check. And so, interestingly enough, Morgoth's ability to go back to Middle-earth and rule it again as a tyrant is again limited by the fact that he creates these enemies in the Noldor who then come back and lay siege to him for hundreds of years. He eventually, of course, ends up being victorious, but it's also through the Noldor that he ends up facing his ultimate defeat, because through some of the Noldor and their descendants, you get Eärendil, who ends up going back to Valinor and getting the aid of the Valar to come back and finally defeat Morgoth for the last time, or second to last time, depending on, what sources you're reading. But anyway, because there's supposed to be like a Ragnarok-style battle at the very end, or an Armageddon, but that's kind of all in prophecy. It doesn't happen in the story. Anyway, Eärendil is a descendant of the Noldor, in part, and so by bringing the Noldor there, you get the marriages of the Noldor with men, which is how you get Eärendil. You get Luthien marrying Beren. You get their kids marrying Eärendil. You're getting Elros and Elrond. You get all of these different things that wouldn't have happened but for the Noldor coming back. And, all of this kind of leads to Morgoth's downfall. It's also worth noting that another aspect of the Noldor coming back to Middle-earth is that Fingolfin challenges Morgoth to a duel and hacks up his foot pretty bad, in addition to wounding him 7 other times before he finally gets killed by Morgoth. So Fingolfin is a very concrete example of how making enemies of the Noldor might not have been such a smart idea. But it, that doesn't defeat Morgoth in the end, but it's a nice foretaste. And it's probably one that Morgoth was not happy about, because it does say that after that battle with Fingolfin, he never again leaves his own walls. And so it's like, again, there's that aspect of cowardice. The more he tries to control everything, the more he wants to just sit back and let all of his, servants and slaves do their thing, and he's just going to sit back and mastermind it. So there's kind of the more interesting, specific instance of him creating his own worst enemy and eventually leading to his downfall. So, those were some examples of how the villains in Tolkien end up leading to their own demise, or at least shooting themselves in the foot when trying to obtain their ultimate goals through their master plans, which never really seem to work out. Do you know of any other good examples of this happening in Tolkien? If you do, please do leave them in the comments. Might be an interesting discussion. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and a thumbs up, and share it around. And if you follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, you'll get some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel over here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.